You're listening to the podcast in Armao on the Brink. I'm Rosemary Armao. As many of you know, I teach at a large public university in Albany, teach journalism. Administratively, we're in the School of Arts and Sciences, and all of that is by way of saying we are not in a good place. Public universities are under fire from conservatives who want to portray professors as these liberal propagandists leading young people by the nose down the wrong path. And need I do more than to remind you of what the president says about the value of journalism, or of DEI, or of education in general. Also, young people, and especially their parents, put in the bill, they want to take courses that will immediately lead them to jobs that can enable them to leave home, start paying off student loans. Enrollment overall is down at all colleges, but especially enrollment is down in the humanities these days. The prospects are not bright. You could see this at our recent gathering for prospective new students at UAlbany. The tables that were staffed by professors of, sociology, English, communication, philosophy, gender studies, they were all deserted. And the professors of Homeland Security and of IT were overwhelmed. So I want to talk in this podcast with colleagues in departments that are as beleaguered as my own. That would be English and Women and Gender Studies. I want to talk with them about what it means to be raising a generation of college students who have practical degrees, but very little, if any, liberal arts. And my first guest is Martha Rozett. Before her retirement a few years back from UAlbany, she was a celebrated professor of English, an author, a scholar of Shakespearean and Elizabethan drama. I was frankly intimidated by this towering intellect until I was lucky enough to get to know her. She has noticeably not been replaced at UAlbany since she retired, and no Shakespearean courses completely dedicated to Shakespeare are offered anymore. As there are no more courses at UAlbany in the classics. So thank you for coming on, Martha. It's a little bit of a depressing topic. Let me start with this. What do you think it means that Shakespeare is gone from the curriculum?
I think Shakespeare had a better chance of staying in the curriculum than many other old authors because Shakespeare was still being taught in high school. Now, maybe it isn't now, but for a long time, there might have been no Dickens, no Jane Austen, no Mark Twain, no Emily Dickinson even in high school, but there was still Shakespeare. And that's partly because Shakespeare has become so much part of our common culture, our popular culture. There are movies, there are theater festivals, there are ways to engage with Shakespeare that don't simply involve reading the words on page. And we know that for students, reading words on pages is becoming an increasingly obsolete form of activity, especially if it involves sitting still for a great long time. The wonderful thing about Shakespeare, there were many wonderful things. One was you could divide it up into acts and scenes and line numbers, and you could read speeches aloud and have students read speeches aloud and act them out and try to decide how to stage them, whether they were drawing a sword or, whatever. So I gave some thought, Rosemary, to what I could say about why I think students should continue to read Shakespeare. I can't tell you why UAlbany is not offering classes in Shakespeare. I assume it's because they think students won't take them. And of course, students won't take them if they're not offered. And if they're not offered regularly, students don't even know that they're there. But here's why I think students should continue to read Shakespeare. And it's partly because it's fun, although it's not easy. The language, as you and I know, is different. It's from several centuries ago, is complex, what we call heightened language. But I used to say to my students who said that their future was, to go to law school. A lot of students used to say that. I don't think they say that anymore. But they used to. And I'd say, well, reading Shakespeare and decoding this complicated language and figuring out new vocabulary words from context, that's what you'll be doing when you're reading those law books in law school. But obviously, there's a even more important reason for future lawyers or future business people or future IT specialists or whatever to read Shakespeare. And here are some of the things that I've been thinking about. I think the words in the plays, the characters in the plays, the ideas in the plays help encourage habits of thought that make for a more nuanced understanding of people in the present and events in the past and how the past shapes the present. I think that the sounds of the poetry, the poetic language, the imagery will enrich people's lives. The fact that young people are drawn to songs, popular songs, suggests that sound and imagery
and poetry
and analogies and poetry are things that they enjoy, that they understand, and that's in the plays. If the plays are taught in a way that is playful, shall we say, and engaging and fun, but also rigorous. I think drawing a wider net, casting a wider net, literary humor and satire, whether it's in fiction or in poetry or in plays, helps us question our assumptions and sharpen our wits. I think we need that right now. The heroes and the heroines of Shakespeare's plays or of novels and various forms of literature could offer us models to emulate, but there are all those other characters, and they're just as important with their quirks and their biases, their clearly defined roles in the social order. Sometimes they are kind or clever servants. Sometimes they are quarrelsome siblings. Sometimes they are ambitious or arrogant people in power. Sometimes they're fools. Sometimes they're the wise ones who expose the folly of the fools. Sometimes they're impressionable young people. Sometimes they're older people. Sometimes they're parents who are set in their ways and don't understand the younger people. These character types, as I think you know, Rosemary, appear throughout not just Shakespeare, but 19th century fiction, for instance, and into the 20th century as well. And when a student says to me, you know, that character Ophelia, she sounds awfully familiar. I think she's a character in a soap opera. I say that's because the guys who wrote the soap opera, or the women, were taking Shakespeare in college, and that's where they were getting the character types and the situations and the parent-child dynamics and so on. That's why Ophelia or Desdemona reminds you of a girl in a soap opera.
There is a lot of news right now about Grand Theft Hamlet. It's a takeoff on a very popular video game, but it's from Hamlet. It's the same stories, Shakespeare, and as you say, lots of literature that are, it's just so unpopular right now, at least as college offerings, are all about the complexities of life, all about the humanness that has to be confronted, the foibles, all those things you mentioned. And it got me to thinking about our worries right now about AI, where we have engineers and scientists and mechanics kind of running amok without the background of a liberal arts humanities background. Isn't the ideal to have both? Can't you take engineering and Jane Austen at the same time?
I think many students do that. I have met students over the many years that I taught who took business courses, because that's why they came to Albany, as you know, the university. Am I allowed to say Albany? Is that okay?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Certainly.
The university where I taught and you teach was very well known for its business school. And back when I started teaching in the 70s, the students wanted to go to that business school. They did it partly because they were first generation college students, and that seemed to be their way forward out of the kinds of jobs their parents had. But they also minored in English, and they took English courses, or they minored in music. And this is still going on. The students might not be majoring exclusively in business. Maybe they're going after the College of Engineering and Information Science. They keep changing the names of those colleges, so I'm not quite sure what they're all called. But you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do. I understand.
The IT colleges, the various sciences. Science has become more important at UAlbany than it was when I started teaching, and I think that's fine. I think we need scientists. We need homegrown scientists.
Yeah.
And depending on scientists who come to us from other countries because they learn science better in those other countries. But that doesn't mean the students can't take Shakespeare or can't take a course in the novel or
well, they can't if they're I'm sorry to interrupt. They can't if the courses are not being offered, as you pointed out before.
Precisely. Precisely.
Yeah, incredibly what's happening. As you say, there are, of course, trends in higher education. I recently looked at a curriculum from what was required of a well-educated young man during colonial times in America. It's fascinating. It's dead languages. Greek and Latin were required, philosophy, theology, all topics that the typical college student would not take now. Does this latest turn that we're seeing, this latest downturn for humanities, feel different in any way, or is this just, normal?
Well, it's hard to know what's normal right now. I don't know. There was a time when lots and lots of students majored in English, but not necessarily for the right reason. They majored in English because English was what they've been doing, language arts. It came to be called ever since first grade. And so they thought, well, I know I can do that. Fewer students major in English now, quite a few fewer. And not just at Albany, at other places.
It's not just in Albany, not just in the U.S. It is a worldwide phenomena that the humanities are lacking in support and love.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I would like to think that kid who is majoring in business or psychology, but who performs in a student play, and I've seen some of those kids who are performing in the theater department's plays. They're not theater majors anymore, but they're performing in the plays. I'd like to think that they are doing something that connects them to the humanities.
There's quite a connection I've often seen between the sciences and mathematics and music. So you have, for example, in Boston, a wonderful orchestra that's made up entirely of doctors. The orchestra is like their hobby. It's fabulous. It's, professional grade, but they're not musicians, they're doctors. So it's not as if the two are incompatible. Right. Although I think a lot of that comes from the politics, which is, as I mentioned at the beginning, larded onto this. It isn't just humanities; it's those damn liberal professors.
Right.
Do you really think that you are leading your students by teaching them to decode difficult language and to figure out emotion and to listen to the rhythm? Do you really think you are leading them to bad political views?
No, I don't think so. I think that occasionally some political views would find their way into the conversation. The last full adult ed course I taught here in the Albany area in about 2018 was called pre-COVID. What can we learn from Shakespeare's Kings? Which was a provocative. That. Okay, so 2018, you know what was going on in 2018, right? Trump was president, but I was teaching adults, and there were, I'm sure, some Trump voters among those adults in that classroom, although mostly they were liberal people like me, maybe not wildly liberal, not far left progressives, which I wouldn't say I am. But they got it. They got it. We were talking about Richard III and Macbeth and the things that they did that led them to where they ended up, and how that's something that politicians would do well to know about, shall we say, to
pay attention to. That I was going to ask you a question. I promised you I wouldn't ask you to quote any Shakespeare.
No, please don't.
It's been a while since you had to do that.
I know. I was never good at it, strangely enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I would have thought that. I think my listeners, by the way, by now realize why I wanted Martha Rozett, retired Professor Emerita from UAlbany, just a fine teacher and a scholar and an author, several books, more than a few. She's eloquent on these topics, and you can see why you can see I wanted to run. But I was going to ask you not to quote Shakespeare, which be only because I promised not to, but who you would compare Trump to. I did not realize you had actually taught a course on this. What king is most relevant to understanding?
Oh, well, I would say, well, I'd say maybe Richard III, who surrounded himself, well, who killed off a lot of people, and contrived to make the people who were in his way disappear, and then became very dependent on his friend Buckingham. So that's interesting, right? And Buckingham eventually realized that he wasn't going to get the reward that he was expecting for his dutiful service in helping Richard get the throne. You probably remember, or maybe your listeners don't remember, that Richard was not directly in line for the throne, so he had to get rid of one of his brothers after the oldest brother, who was the king, died, and then he had to do something about the king's children. And so there's the famous story of the two little princes in the tower, and nobody really knows exactly how those two little princes died in the tower. It could have been somebody else who did it, but in the popular imagination, Richard became a villain. And this was because history was written by the winners, and the guy who ultimately defeated him, Henry Tudor, the first of the Tudor line that led to Queen Elizabeth and so on. Henry Tudor may have made sure that the historians wrote the history the way he wanted it to be written. And I think that's a lesson for our time too. Who's writing the history? Who's writing the press releases? Who's writing the narratives about our time, and how accessible are the counter narratives, if any? So anyway, this very villainous, scheming, but charming in a scary way, Richard depended on his friend Buckingham until finally Buckingham realized he'd had enough and left. So he didn't live. Not too many people were alive at the end of the play, but Henry Tudor was. And there's that famous line. This is a line I can quote: my horse, a kingdom for a horse." Richard, those are his last words on the battlefield, and then the next thing you know, he's dead, and a new dynasty begins. A dynasty that was very effective. The Tudors, Henry VII, Henry VIII, his daughter Queen Elizabeth, very effective at manipulating their images and what passed for press.
And they wrote the history.
Yeah.
Martha, the philosophers and their departments are as much trouble as mine and as yours. They see a connection between the apathy and the I guess liberals think that some would say dumb voting that they're seeing among the electorate today. They see that as connected to the decline of the humanities. I'm not sure that I can make the connection that strongly. What do you think?
Well, I've thought about this. I know that philosophy departments teach courses in logic. I don't know exactly how they teach it, whether it's more mathematical or not. And they teach courses in ethics. Exactly. If everybody took a good course in logic and ethics, probably not when they're 19, probably more like when they're 14 or 13 or 12, and really learned logic and really learned ethics in a way that made sense to them and connected to the real world and wasn't, just a lot of textbook language, I think we'd be better off. I think we would have more informed voters. I think probably many people would agree that in a country where nearly every child can stay in school until the age of 18, and most do, or 17, we should have much better informed voters than we do.
I want to thank Martha Rozett, who I cannot believe was nervous about being on a podcast. You are spectacular. Thank you for being on. And for my listeners, your homework assignment is Richard III. Read all 3 acts, please, by next week. Thank
you. Actually, 5 acts.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I should have known that.
It's a long play.
Thank you for the correction, Professor. Hi, we're back on the Brink with Rosemary Armao, and my next guest, who is just a I admire her work. I admire her. I love listening to her speak. This is Janelle Hobson. She is a professor of gender studies at the University of Albany, where I also have worked. That's where I first encountered her. She's done lots of research on images of Black women in pop culture. She's working on a project right now. We're going to get her to talk about a little bit on Harriet Tubman. Very interesting. She's also a writer for Ms. Magazine and other places. And your work is not valued anymore, Janelle.
Hmm.
Women's studies is under attack. Tell us about that. What does that feel like to be told this topic that you have spent your life working on, accomplished quite a bit in, and now it's not valued?
Was it ever? I mean, yes, it is very disconcerting, unsettling to know that we are under attack politically. However, I think women's studies, women's gender and sexuality studies more broadly have always recognized that we have always taught and researched against the grain. Um,
Mhm.
so as much as many who founded the field in academia, as much as they tried to establish us and to institutionalize us, I think we've always felt that kind of marginalization. So on the one hand, it's disappointing that we are still fighting against certain forces that wish to vilify us or to see us as some kind of problem. And then on the other
Mhm.
hand, obviously we are doing something that is life-changing, that is a real social movement for people to be afraid of it. Doing something.
or you bring up a good point that
Yeah,
you've always been sort of on the outs, but women's studies departments, and they were women's studies departments in the beginning, came
yeah,
about because of student activism. There was a call on the
yes.
part of the students for these kinds of programs. Talk about that.
Yes. And I think that's what's so interesting about these particular programs, like women's studies and ethnic studies, that came out of that movement for social change. I'm thinking specifically of the civil rights movement
Absolutely.
and student protests and that moment in the 60s and 70s when students wanted to challenge that the only authority and the only knowledge producers were valued. Those who were valued were mostly white men. They still are the majority, but it's interesting that even in just the past 50, 60 years, in which we've had programs in women's studies and Africana studies and, all of those kinds of interdisciplinary
Hmm.
programs that we've been pushing the needle just a bit, but it's enough for those who are empowered to decide, okay, that's enough.
Hmm.
We've seen enough. And so when I say we must be doing something right for there to be this kind of pushback, it's just a reminder that those who would find us threatening realize that we have been making inroads. And I believe that academia is just one part of society. When we think of those particular marginalized communities who've been pushing, who've been inspired by those civil rights activists who were able to say no more with Jim Crow racism and
Hmm.
no more with patriarchy in terms of the feminist movement. You have people who are willing to say we can do better and let's do better, which is
Hmm.
really what all of the diversity, equity, and inclusion is about. It's about let's live up to that idea of equality and justice for all that we've been saying we're about in this country and really move to make things more equitable, make things more equal.
I've always had the view, I love women's studies programs. I never majored in it, but I took plenty of courses in them. They were eye-opening. And I always had the view that many people didn't understand what went on in a so-called women's studies class.
Yeah.
And had more men taken the classes, they would be more popular.
Yeah.
So, to that point, can you talk a little bit about your project on Harriet Tubman, which I think shows the sort of research and the sort of knowledge that comes out of these programs? Take a
Yeah.
minute, okay?
Oh,
It's really
absolutely.
fascinating.
Yes, Harriet Tubman has just been such a fascinating figure for me for the past decade. And it came out of my overall work on
Hmm.
Black women, both in terms of Black women's histories as well as representations of Black women. And what drew me to Harriet Tubman is the way that she became an icon in our culture. Because I study images and representations, that's how I had that little entry point into studying Harriet Tubman. And then, of course, it's the interdisciplinary focus where I could look at both popular culture as well as history to examine what her iconography means for us overall. So the new project that I'm looking at, I did a public scholarship project with Ms. Magazine called the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project that came out in 2022, which was a celebration of her 200th birthday, uh,
Hmm.
born circa 1822. So it was an opportunity to revisit and to broaden the knowledge of who she is beyond just the kind of legends and myths about her. And that was a series that I did and was able to invite different scholars and artists to share the different ways that we can think about her legacy. So, what I'm doing with regards to the new project, sometimes I call it a biography, sometimes I just call it yet another scholarly work. uh, because biography seems so daunting to me, but I'm very much interested in what I'm calling a Harriet Tubman's America. And by
Oh,
that, yes, by that I mean I want us to think about what this nation could be if we really were able to celebrate her on the national scale. There was the promise, obviously, of having her eventually on our money, our currency, in terms of the $20 bill.
wow.
Uh,
I have a little stamp of Harriet Tubman and I put
oh,
it
I'm
on
sure
all
you do.
$20 bills when I
I,
get them.
I'm sure you do. And with the current leadership, I'm sure that's going to be stalled. But what gives me hope is that since the projected date was supposed to be 2030, that gives us a date. That
Hmm.
gives us a date into the
Yes.
future.
Yes.
And what I like about that is that it gives us a date beyond
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
term.
The
Okay.
current.
Yes,
It.
and if we keep our eyes on that, then we can see beyond current issues. And why I say that is thinking about history, and I think it's so important for women's studies to always incorporate history in our interdisciplinary studies because it's never a good idea to just focus on the contemporary because if
Mhm.
you only look at the contemporary, then you're not able to establish continuity uh,
Right.
to see, well, what did the women do way back when? It's important to remember, oh yeah, this we're not new to this fight. We're not new to this struggle. Harriet Tubman freed herself from slavery and then went back 13 different times to free other people. Yeah, we can call that a supernatural superhero thing to do, but if we actually study history, then we realize that there's regular women, they're regular human beings who rose to the occasion and
You gave it's inspiring. You gave a presentation recently in which you talked about the elements of activism, something for some reason we seem to be talking about
yeah.
contemporarily. And one of those was longevity.
Yes, absolutely.
You look back in the
Longevity.
past.
Absolutely. So there's thinking about the past and what women like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony and all those women did in terms of fighting and realizing that those women, so for example, all those women I mentioned, they had a vision for women being able to vote. None of them lived
To actually see it. Yep.
actually see it. And I think we need to keep that in mind that sometimes the fight that we're doing now is really for future generations. So I think we need to have that broader scope. So Harriet Tubman's America, in terms of my new project, is actually just as much about the future as it is about the past. And by that,
Yep.
I've actually been thinking of what I'm calling an ancestral future or an ancestral futurism, so that when I think of Harriet Tubman and what she was able to accomplish in the past in terms of the 19th century, she died March 10th, 1913, so she came into our the 20th
Right.
century. Uh, I'm also interested in thinking of what does her presence also mean for us when we project into the future, let's say 2030, when we promise to put her on the $20 bill. What kind
Yeah.
of America are we going to have in 2030 that actually lives up to the meaning of who Harriet Tubman is? And she's all about freedom and she's all about justice. She's all about equality. Can we have that country? Can we have
Oh,
America? So that's
I
what the Harriet Tubman's America project is about.
I think my listeners are getting an idea of why I like your work and I like hearing about it. And it's so ironic to me that in addition to not understanding gender studies,
Yeah,
I think the programs are in trouble because it's seen as having no relevance. Women are fine now. And
yeah,
what better last question to have you talk about than
yeah,
the current just crusade against DEI?
yeah. Yes, absolutely. So the crusade against DEI, which is just code word,
Of course it is. Yeah.
it's just a code word, is really about bringing back segregation.
Yeah.
Or as a colleague of mine, Brittany Cooper, who is at Rutgers University, she calls it resegregation. Think, we should start calling things for what they are and not the codes that they
Mhm.
supposedly represent. DEI was obviously just a kind of policy that was implemented to try to work towards inclusion and towards equity. And it was doing some work. It wasn't always as effective, I think, over the years in terms of really bringing more people on board in terms of the kind of diversity we want to see in the work
Right.
and in education. But they were trying to make those strides. So the current pushback against it is not about slowing. Well, it is about slowing down progress, but it's also about really taking us back to an actual resegregation. It is absolutely terrified of a future that is more multiracial. It's terrified of a future where more women, more sexual minorities, more people from various marginalized identities like disabled and what have you can actually have access to not just positions, professional positions, but positions of authority.
Right.
And we see that in Project 2025, for example, in what they are targeting with
Mhm.
regard to the changes they want to see. So it's disheartening because you realize that those particular forces that are against DEI, they're just afraid of a multiracial America.
They are. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
are. And
Harriet Tubman would recognize this whole effort. She would
yes, oh,
recognize this
absolutely.
crusade. Hmm.
Oh,
All right, my last question, Janelle. We're running out of time, or have run out, but we'll take care of that.
absolutely.
Um, if they won, if the bad guys won, and the humanities, including gender studies, are cut out, what does society lose?
Well, if they win, what they lose is Whew. Well, you just have to go back to what happened to. This is why I like history, because we've been here before. Just go back to the 1890s, go back to the early 20th century, go back to the bad old days when women didn't have access to many things, not just reproductive rights. Most people don't realize that something like legal abortion or when abortion was illegal was only that only happened in the late 19th century. The first
Mhm.
abortion bans were in the late 19th century, which incidentally also took place around the same time that we had bans, immigration bans, and immigration quotas. Uh, so
That
it's
sounds familiar.
yes, it's
Yeah.
not a coincidence, and it's also that same era when we had all the 1% of the wealthy in terms of the Gilded Age, and you had that huge gap between the rich and the poor.
Inequality, right.
The inequality was out of control. So what do you have? You have that. You have that.
I recognize that too.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
You have been listening to Professor Janelle Hobson. She is a professor of gender studies at U Albany and a friend and a really smart woman. Thank you so much for being with us today.